In this chapter, we'll study tissues. The study of tissues is called histology. You have trillions of cells in your body, and they're organized into complex units called tissues. So what's a tissue? Well, tissues are made of similar cells that perform a common function. We're going to look at the four major tissue types in the human body. So as I just mentioned, tissues are composed of cells that have a similar structure and similar function. They also originate from a common layer during embryonic development. Now we'll talk about that some in A&P 2, but think about it. You start out as one cell that's created when a sperm and an egg cell get together, and somehow that one cell ends up being a baby, a living, breathing organism. So some of the cells begin to replicate, and as they do, there are different cells that are going to create different body structures. So typically, tissues will be a particular type of tissue will have cells from a common embryonic layer of cells during development. So tissues are comprised of the cells, the extracellular matrix, which is stuff outside the cell, and the products of those cells. What's the cell making? We have four major categories of tissues. They're varied in their structure as well as their function. Now, after chapter 1, you should already realize that. So our four categories are epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Your textbook gives us a nice little acronym to remember that. If we start with con, so C-O-N, that's our connective tissue. Then we have muscle, epithelial, and nervous tissue. Pretty cool, huh? All right, so we're going to examine each of these four categories in a bit more detail, and then you'll get a whole lot more information on muscle and nervous tissue when we get to those chapters later this semester. In this initial overview, you can see all four of our major tissue types. Now look at them. See how different they all appear. Your epithelial tissues, you've got layers and layers of cells here. Now it's not always layers, but sometimes it is. But these cells are tightly packed together. Well, that's great because we use epithelial tissues for covers and linings. Look at your connective tissue. Connective tissue has a few cells scattered throughout in there, okay? But also all these little stringy things, well, those are protein fibers. And then the background stuff, this pale color, just very, very pale purple, that's part of the extracellular matrix, which I think of it sort of like Jell-O. It's a lot of goo with all those proteins and cells embedded in there. Now we're going to talk about that in a good bit more detail as well. And then we have our third category, the muscle tissue. Muscle cell shape varies depending on what type of muscle it is. We have three major types of muscle. The cells appear different, but they all have one thing in common, and that is they cause movement to occur. And then our fourth category is nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is responsible for control, communication, and coordination. So if you look at this cell right here, this is a neuron, which is the main type of cell in nervous tissue. These are going to be able, with all those branches coming off the cell, to communicate, control, and coordinate things with many other cells in many different types of tissue. All right, that's your overview. We'll begin with epithelials. Epithelial tissues are composed of one or more layers of cells that are very tightly packed together and held together with several different types of junctions. So junctions means to join, right? So these cells are held together very tightly with little to no extracellular matrix. So extracellular matrix, I want you to think of that as the stuff outside the cell. Now we'll get into more details with that when we get into our connective tissue. But just think of it's what's outside the cell, extracellular, okay? Now, epithelial tissues are going to cover body surfaces and line body cavities, so spaces within the body, and also forms most of the glandular tissue in our bodies. The functions of epithelial tissue, well, it really depends on where the tissue is, what type it is, and of course, what its job is. So epithelial tissues, because they provide covers and linings, they provide physical protection, both internal and external surfaces of our body. So they're protected from losing too much water. That prevents dehydration. Also, just being a covering helps to protect us against abrasion and anything that could cause harm, such as physical, chemical, or biological agents that could damage if they were able to penetrate through those epithelial layers and get to the underlying tissues. Epithelials are selectively permeable. Now, we talked about selectively permeable when we mentioned our cell membrane, and that simply means that some things can get in and out and some things can't. So think of your epithelial tissues sort of as gatekeepers. They determine what gets in or out of the body or in or out of an organ because, again, they line and they cover. Epithelial tissues also produce and release things we call secretions. So these cells form glands, and glands can be either individual cells that are scattered within other cells, or they can be clusters of cells and form a multicellular gland. It's within our epithelial tissues that we house sensory nerve receptors that detect and respond to a stimulus. So that happens because epithelial tissues are highly innervated. They're very, very rich in nerves. But as far as vascularity, they're avascular. That means without vascular. So vascular refers to blood vessels. So epithelial tissues don't have blood vessels. So how do they get their nutrients? How do they metabolize and do what they need to do? Well, they get all of that by diffusion from the tissues that lie underneath the epithelial tissues. Now, we'll see this really well when we start talking about the skin in our next chapter. And one last characteristic that I want to talk about with epithelial tissues is that they are highly mitotic. You recognize that word? Make you think of mitosis? Yeah? Good, because that's exactly what I'm talking about. So epithelial tissues are constantly undergoing frequent mitosis. Again, think about this. They line body structures and they cover. So they're constantly losing the top layer of cells and layers of cells. Your skin is made up, the part that you see of your skin, you see here in this top image, the epidermis, this is what you see, and it's actually layers and layers and layers of epithelial tissues. Well, the ones that are on the outside, the most superficial, they're already dead because they're far away from the blood vessels that are down in the deeper layer of the skin, which is called the dermis. So those cells are constantly dying. Think about your digestive system. It's lined with epithelial tissues, remember, linings and coverings. So when you eat food, when you're passing your food products through your intestines and then your waste products out your anus, well, there's friction as things are moving against the walls of those tubular structures, beginning at the mouth and ending at the anus. So that friction, of course, is wearing cells off. If we didn't constantly replace them with mitosis of epithelial tissues, then those tissues would soon disappear because we would wear them away. As we continue looking at epithelial characteristics, epithelial tissues have something we call polarity, which simply means it's different in one place versus another. So epithelial tissues have an apical or free surface, and this is simply the surface that is exposed either to the external environment or to the internal structures in the body. So the apical surface of the epithelial of your skin would be the part that you actually see, the most superficial. The apical surface of the digestive tract would be, of the epithelial tissues of the digestive tract, would be the opening, the cells that are part of the opening. So if you look at this blood vessel right here, just imagine this is a tubular, or I'll draw one right here. So oh, my little thing's not going to draw for me today. So back up. So if we have a tubular structure, so imagine this right here, this blood vessel. Let's say this is your digestive system instead. So the cells that line the opening is called a lumen, those would be the free or apical surface that would be touching or would be the open part. So think of it as the part that's not touching anything, okay? Now, we also have the basal surface. Basal, I want you to think the bottom. So the basal surface, of course, is going to be attached to something called a basement membrane. That basement membrane is connective tissues that forms a barrier between the epithelial tissues and the underlying connective tissues. Now, notice in this image, here we've got epithelial tissues. There's our basement membrane, the glue that holds the epithelial to the underlying connective tissues. Here we have the apical surface, the free surface, okay? This is the basal surface attached to the basement membrane. Now, on that free surface, we may have cilia or microvilli. So remember back, we talked about this when we did cell structure and function. Cilia are very numerous and sort of longish projections of the cell membrane, and their purpose is to move things along a passageway or along a surface, such as fluids and mucus. So things just move in that liquidy environment of our body. So I think of cilia sort of like little grasses in a pond or seagrass in the ocean. Every time the water is moving, the little grass pieces are moving, right? So because we are wet, if there's cilia extending off the apical surface of these, then that cilia is constantly moving, and that helps us move things along a surface. Now, the other thing is the microvilli. So microvilli are also projections of the cell membrane, but they're small and they are also on that apical surface, but they increase the surface area. So you find a lot of microvilli on the epithelial tissues that line your digestive tract, because if the food products that are passing through there only go across a flat surface, then we're not going to absorb a lot. But if you've got lots of projections and folds of those cell membranes on that apical surface, then that gives us more space, more tissue across which we can absorb those nutrients. So with epithelial tissues forming coverings and linings, we need a way to classify them based on the number of cells and the shape of the cells. So the name of epithelial tissues typically has two words. The first part tells you the number of epithelial layers of cells. The second part refers to the shape of those cells. So let's look first at classification by the number of layers. So simple is one layer of epithelial cells, and all of those cells connect to the basement membrane. And then, of course, the upper part, the part that doesn't touch anything, would be the apical surface. So here you see one layer of epithelial cells. So they're all attached to the basement membrane, and they all have a free surface. Stratified means layered. A stratum is a layer. Okay, so stratified epithelial cells have two or more layers, sometimes a lot of layers, sometimes just a few. But only the bottom layer of cells is attached to the basement membrane, and the most superficial layer, the ones closest to the surface, of course, are the apical surface, the free surface. So you can think of this sort of like a brick wall. Only the bottom layer of bricks is going to touch the ground, right? So think of the ground as the basement membrane, and only the bricks on the very top would be the free surface, not attached to anything. And one more, that is our pseudo-stratified. So pseudo means false. So these tissues, pseudo-stratified epithelial, appear to be layered, but they're really not. So all of the cells are attached to the basement membrane, but not all of them reach all the way to the top to have a free surface. Now, when you look at these tissues, you'll see that the nuclei of the cells in pseudostratified are at different layers or at different levels within the cell, not layers, because remember, pseudostratified, only one layer, but it looks like there are many. So when the nuclei get squished to the bottom or pushed up to the top of the cell, then sometimes it looks like you have many different layers of cells. But remember, with pseudostratified, they're fake layers. They're all attached to the basement membrane. They just may not all push all the way up to have the free surface. So we find that simple epithelial tissues where we don't have a lot of stress, but we need filtration, absorption, and secretion. Okay, so one layer of cells, things are going to be able to pass through much easier. Stratified epithelial cells, we need this where we need more structural support or better protection of the underlying tissues. So the cells in the basal layer that are attached to the basement membrane are constantly undergoing mitosis and regenerating, making more cells, because the cells that are at the apical surface are constantly dying off and slopping off. That's where most of the dust in your house comes from too. We also classify epithelial tissues, as I mentioned, based on the shape of the cells. So when we look at simple epithelium, remember that's only one layer, all the cells are pretty much the same shape because there's nothing squishing them, right? But when you look at stratified, the difference in the shape can be seen when you look at the cells closer to the basal layer as compared to those at the apical layer. So let's look at this layer of stratified epithelial we have here, or this example of stratified epithelial. If you look at the cells down here closest to the basement membrane, they appear sort of cube-like. So they're sort of boxy, as are the ones just above it. But as we continue going higher and higher, so closer to the free surface, you notice the cells are becoming more elongated and more squishy. Okay? Now, what we don't see in this are tall columnar looking cells. So these squishy cells are called squamous epithelial. Squamous actually means scaly, but I say squamous is squashed, and that way you remember. So they're flat, wide cells, usually sort of irregular in their shape. Think of them very much like floor tiles. The nucleus is also very flattened in these cells. Cuboidal cells are sort of boxy, such as you see here when we look at some of these cells closer to the basement membrane. So boxy, like a cube. Now, they're never going to be perfectly square because that's just not the way the body is. So their edges will be sort of rounder. Their nucleus is usually pretty round and fat within there as well. And then the columnar cells, well, they're like columns. They're rectangular for the most part. Again, they're not going to be perfect rectangles, but they're going to be very slender and taller than they are wide. We have one additional type that doesn't get mentioned all the time, and it's not even printed on the slide here, but they're called transitional cells, and they just change their shape based on the degree that they're stretched. So think about your urinary bladder. It's lined with columnar, or it's lined with epithelial cells. Now, when you think about epithelial cells lining a container, and that container fills and empties and fills and empties. When the container is filled with urine, then the container is being stretched, very much like a water balloon when you put more liquid in it. Well, that's going to cause the cells to flatten out more. When the bladder is more empty, the cells are going to be more squishy, right? So more fat. So they may be more cuboidal when the bladder is empty, maybe even columnar. And then when the bladder is fuller, they smash flat, more like the squamous cells. So we call them transitional because their shape changes based on the pressure put upon them. And obviously, this slide is just showing you all the different combinations. So the types of epithelial, first of all, we classify by the number of layers. Simple epithelial, 1 layer. Stratified, 2 or more layers of cells. And then you have simple squamous, 1 layer of squishy cells. Simple cuboidal, 1 layer of sort of cube-like cells. Simple columnar, 1 layer of tall, slender cells. Pseudo-stratified columnar. Remember, it's still simple because it's only 1 layer. These are the ones that just appear to be layered. And then you have the same thing with your stratified. The only difference we have here is with the stratified squamous, we have a subcategory of keratinized versus non-keratinized. And we'll talk more about those as well. I know this slide may be difficult to see the details and the small writing on it, but this is in your textbook, so I'm just going to go ahead and talk you through it as we look at these different examples of simple epithelial tissues. So here in the first image, we have simple squamous epithelial. What does that tell you? Exactly, simple, 1 layer, squamous, squished flat. Okay? So the function of these, of course, is to provide a very, very thin barrier that allows for diffusion and filtration to happen very easily. Also, we find these making up the serous membranes that line organs and cavities. Now, remember we talked about that earlier as well. So where do you find this? In the air sacs of the lungs. We call those alveoli. They line the opening or the lumen of our blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. The serous membranes, of course, that I mentioned are also made of simple squamous epithelial cells. Now, in picture B, we have simple cuboidal, 1 layer of boxy cells. These function primarily for absorption and secretion, and they form the secretory tissues of glands and ducts. So we find these lining the tubules in our kidneys that filter our blood. The thyroid gland is made up of these follicles that make some hormones for us, and of course the follicles themselves are made up of the cuboidal cells. The surface of the ovary and some of the secretory regions and ducts of most of our exocrine glands. Now remember, exocrine means it secretes through a duct onto a surface or outside of the body. Oh wow, doesn't that sound familiar? Epithelial tissues, line surfaces, right? All right, let's keep rolling. Now here we have non-ciliated simple columnar. Non-ciliated, no cilia. Simple, 1 layer. Columnar, tall, slender cells. So these are important for absorption and secretion. So we find these non-ciliated cells lining parts of our gastrointestinal tract, such as the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. So typically we would find lots of microvilli on these cells, not cilia. Remember, cilia helps to move things along a passageway. Well, this is a passageway, but we don't want it moving quickly. We want to be able to take our time and go across all those folds of cell membrane, microvilli, to increase the surface area so that we absorb more of those nutrients. And then the last image we have is ciliated simple columnar epithelial. So again, the little hair-like projections sticking off the top. 1 layer, simple, columnar, long and slender. So these are going to be important in secreting mucus and moving that mucus along the surface of our epithelial passageways. Also, it helps to move the oocyte or the egg cells along the fallopian tubes once ovulation has occurred. So where do you find these? Lining the bigger of our respiratory passageways, and also obviously in the uterine tubes. All right, let's continue with our epithelial. So ciliated, pseudostratified, columnar, epithelial. Boy, that's a mouthful, huh? Let's take it one word at a time. Ciliated. That tells us it has cilia. Pseudostratified, false layers. Columnar, long, slender cells. Now, let's look at this. All these purple dots you see right here are nuclei. And it looks like because there's nuclei way down here and nuclei here and here and here and everywhere, right? It looks like there are many layers of cells, but it's really not. They're just so tightly packed in there together, even though they're all attached down here to the basement membrane, they're squished in so tightly together that the contents of the cell, including the nuclei, may get pushed down to the bottom or up toward the top or somewhere in the middle. So again, fake layers. So we have our pseudostratified columnar where we need extra protection, but it also secretes mucus and helps to move things along passageways. So again, we see some of this in the respiratory passages as well as within our nasal cavity. And I'm going to go ahead and do this, guys. You see these words right here? Parts of the pharynx, parts of the larynx, trachea and bronchi. That's part of your respiratory tubes. Now, did you notice I didn't say pharynx and I didn't say larynx? There's a reason for that. You don't have them. You don't have a pharynx. You don't have a larynx. You have a pharynx and a larynx. Remember, Y is pronounced as I, R-I-N-X. Rinx, pharynx, larynx. Yep, that's one of my pet peeves. Can't help it. It is. All right. And then we'll move into our stratified epithelium. And our last two images here from table 5.3 are stratified epithelial. So remember, this is multiple layers with only the deepest layer of cells attached to that basement membrane. So the cells in that basal layer are going to be sort of cuboidal in their shape, whereas the cells closer to the apical surface are going to be more flat or squamous in their shape. So the epithelium of the stratified type protects the underlying tissues from damage that would be caused by abrasion or friction, as I mentioned a while ago, like the digestive tract or the tissues that cover our body, epithelial tissues of the skin. So in the base layer of these stratified epithelial, we have something called stem cells. Those stem cells are constantly dividing, and when they do so, they create one cell that's going to remain a stem cell. The other cell is going to be the epithelial cell that does the job of that particular type of tissue, that particular cell, right? So this is going to allow these cells to be pushed upward as new cells are made. So think of it, you're building from the bottom, so everything on top is getting pushed up, 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 up. Now when those cells get closer to the apical surface, they're farther away from that vascular supply down in the connective tissue, so the cells are dying. So we have two types of stratified squamous epithelial cells, keratinized and non-keratinized. With the keratinized, the superficial layers are composed of cells that are dead. So they don't have a nucleus, organelles, but they're filled with a protein called keratin. That's a tough protective protein that helps to strengthen tissues. So the outer layer of our skin, the epidermis, is made of keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelial tissue. We also have non-keratinized. Well, that's pretty easy to figure out, right? It doesn't have keratin. So these cells, including those that are at the apical surface, because they don't have the keratin, they remain alive. This tissue is always going to be moist tissue because of secretions such as saliva or mucus. So your non-keratinized epithelial tissues form the surface tissue of mucous membranes that line your oral cavity, your pharynx, pharynx, pharynx. That's what we commonly call your throat, not your pharynx. Part of your larynx, 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 not larynx. That's what we commonly call the voice box. Also, you have the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial line your esophagus, vagina, and anus.